John Craven takes a grandstand view of how we used to bring you live pictures.
On Saturday, July the 31st, 1948, under a blazing summer sky, in the presence of their Majesties the King and Queen, and in a spirit of good fellowship that stirred every one of the 80,000 spectators, the international games of the 14th modern Olympiad began at Wembley.
The Olympic Games of 1948 were a godsend to the newly reopened BBC television service. On its doorstep were the world's greatest athletes, and television had the means of bringing live pictures of the games to sports fans lucky enough to have sets.
Behind the Union Jack comes the British contingent, which, in its place of honour as the host of the Games, brings up the very rear of the great athletic procession.
These are the pictures that viewers saw in their homes, preserved for us now by a recording method which in those days was still experimental.
Now there we've come over very abruptly to outside, because here, before we expected it, is the last torch being brought to Wembley Stadium, an escort of motorcycle police and cars round it, and in the centre, running very slowly and splendidly and escorted by 4 other athletes, the bearer, John Mark, the bearer of the Olympic torch.
And when you take it in the context that here was something brand new, a television service with no track record, a programme of that magnitude, to move in, try and make sense of it all, was really quite a concept.
The concept involved mobilising just about every piece of outside broadcast equipment available, most of it pre-war, and setting up mobile control rooms just outside Wembley. Pictures from the stadium and the pool were relayed to a master control nearby. It was a big operation for a very small audience. Only 45,000 homes had television sets, and they were all in the London area. In the stadium, the cameras were Emitrons, used by the BBC since the service began in the 30s. Duncan Anderson was one of the cameramen.
As you can see, there are 2 lenses, one of which was the taking lens for the tube, and the other was a viewfinder lens. And because these 2 lenses are separated, there was a parallax error between the 2, which made it slightly awkward for following subjects, because you had to have these lined up dead accurately. And also, this had a normal ground glass screen, optical viewfinder. One advantage, you got an image in colour. But the image, you may be able to see it, is upside down and back to front, so that when anybody set up, their head would disappear out of the bottom of the viewfinder. And this meant that you had to develop a technique to counterbalance this. It wasn't easy, but once you'd acquired it, everything was all right.
This was the camera that had been used for all outside events, and it certainly had its drawbacks. The single lens gave a fixed size of shot, and cameramen used to joke that they could get a nose or an ear in focus, but not both. They needed a good deal of light, something that couldn't be guaranteed on winter afternoons, and sometimes coverage of sporting events had to be abandoned. But into the Empire Pool, just in time for the Olympics, came a new camera. It gave a better, clearer picture in the right kind of conditions. The cameraman saw the picture he was taking on a miniature television screen, the right way up. And it had a turret of 3 interchangeable lenses instead of just 1. So, using 2 cameras, a producer now had the choice of 6 different shots. But the gear was still far from perfect, as Alan Chivers recalls.
I was in the pool covering swimming on the 3-camera unit, 2 of which were on the swimming, and 1 had to be given up to provide coverage for an interview room. And the thought of covering international swimming on 2 cameras, one of which might well go US at any moment, is horrifying. And I'm very glad they got no recordings of those days to produce as evidence.
But what outside broadcasts really needed was a camera that could work in any kind of weather conditions. The answer came from America with the Image Orthicon.
I remember going with Alan Chilvers to Mill Hill, and it was a very, very cloudy day, thunder threatening, and towards the end of the match that we were broadcasting, it really looked as though we might have to give up. But we had the Image Orthicon being tested on an outside broadcast on this occasion, rigged in a truck. And Alan and I went in. It looked as though the sun was shining as we watched the football with this Image Orthicon. It was such a contrast.
referee signalling it hit him in the stomach. 20 minutes left for play. Bishop Auckland 2, Hendon 0.
The image orthicon became standard equipment at events like this amateur cup final. But viewers still found it wasn't always easy to spot the ball.
An enterprising manufacturer got in touch with me and said, had I thought of a different coloured football? And he brought along to my office 5 varying grades of football, from slightly above the dirty brown, a sort of orangey, yellow, and up to white. And we decided to experiment with this, and we took it, I think it was to Romford Football Ground, because in those days the only football we were allowed to cover for most of the year was amateur. And we also loved to incorporate the viewer in any of our tests. And we invited them to write in. We numbered them all 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And asked them which looked best on their screen, which wasn't a very scientific test, but it involved them in the game. And the club concerned were cooperative enough to change the football every so many minutes. And it turned out that the white football made life a great deal easier for the viewer at home. We stuck a temporary snag in that the manufacturers found that the white football, for some reason, couldn't be coated in such a way as to stop the water being soaked up. So for a few weeks, we were very unpopular because taking a good high header, the footballer's neck tended to disappear into between his shoulders. But in fact, they got it right. And as far as I know, that was the beginning of white football as we see in all major league, professional and international football today.
Head of outside broadcasts Labinier and his assistant Peter Dimmock spent a lot of time trying to persuade the organisers of professional sport to open their gates to television.
The soccer chiefs were very anti-television. We'd actually televised one match live, Charlton against Blackburn, in 1947. But there was an uproar, and all the other league clubs said, no, we mustn't have any live soccer. I think it was, well, there were really 2 reasons. One was money, that I think television at that stage we couldn't have afforded to pay the kind of money that would have brought to the screen a thing like Monday Night Football, which is so successful in the United States in peak time.
Elsewhere, there was, on the whole, a slightly gradual, but a pretty helpful attitude with cricket, with football up to a point. But then I must admit we started with the amateurs. I mean, on the amateur side, you could probably get anywhere with your cameras.
But many professional sports were rarely seen on television. Organisations like the British Boxing Board of Control saw television as a threat, especially at the turnstiles, and they and others were far from happy about any kind of cooperation.
Taking a short rest while the referee counts, but he's up on 6, and that's too soon, I think. And then he goes flat on his back again.
There was an association formed called the Association for Protection of Copyright in Sport. The chap behind this was Frank Gentle, who at that time was boss of the GRA, which ran the White City Stadium, and Haringey. Both those stadiums, a lot of very important events took place, which we wanted to televise. And we had continuing battles against the association. But by and large, we always seemed to manage to reach a compromise that was acceptable.
We were prepared to pay what we call facility fees. And then very gradually one began to imagine at least that a facility fee could involve £50, and so it grew. But still nothing like the size of figure that a promoter was anxious to get for his world championship fight, whatever it was. And it simply meant that you said we shall have 14 engineers, and let's assume that they'd have had to pay the £3 ticket, and that, if you worked it out, was £42, if that is right. And then you have to park a vehicle, and you round it off to something, and it was called a facilities fee, and not a fee for the right to broadcast.
All lined up, Blackpool in the dark shirts kicking off for this 1953 Cup final, and away they go.
The facility fee for the Cup final started at 25 guineas, but by the 1953 final it had gone up to £80. And by this time as well, the BBC was having to pay £1,000 for the rights to broadcast the match.
Out to the great maestro Matthews himself. And after 20 seconds, a corner to Blackpool.
The FA were more far-sighted in a way. They allowed us to do a limited number of matches. Initially we did the second half of the cup final, then we did the whole of the cup final, and we did quite a few FA representative matches and international matches.
There's the man who's really fighting for his cup medal. Could he score the winning goal now himself? Is there? Perry! Perry! What a final! There's the man, Matthews. At long last he's done it. Someone's put 4 for Bolton. They've got the score wrong. They've put it 4 each. Good gracious me. Well, that's just how exciting it's been.
Fairly early on, one fundamental rule was established, and that whatever we did with multiple use of cameras, and the standard was 3, you should position them so that when you cut from one to the other, you didn't jerk your viewer out of a seat at one end of the stadium to a seat at the other end. So it meant bunching your cameras together so the line of sight was the same, and providing the variation by the different sizes in lenses. And that was fairly consistent in all sports.
There'd been cricket on television ever since outside broadcasting began, but it too presented problems over camera positions, as Anthony Craxton discovered at Lord's.
I couldn't get a camera looking straight down from wicket to wicket, which was, I felt, the essential for all cricket coverage. And I badly wanted to get a camera on the first balcony, the members' balcony, where all the elderly members used to sit in great state. And after 9 years of trying, the MCC allowed me to put a camera on this balcony on the condition that if the members, the elderly members, didn't like it, it would be removed at lunchtime. Well, in fact, the members were delighted and intrigued and fascinated by having a television camera there, and it remained there, and it remains there now. We always have one, in fact, I think 2 cameras on the central balcony there. And in all other grounds now, we're able to get cameras almost where we want. And I don't think there's any restriction now to the number.
See how that turned then? A very vicious ball by Morris. A very quick one. Morris might at least get a run out off his over, but no, he won't get a wicket, so it's another one to Billedridge. 55 to him. England 128 for 2, and 4 runs needed. Now, will this be got in one stroke, or? No, brilliantly fielded by Davidson. 2 balls to go this over from Morris. 4 runs to get. Just no, is it the Ashes? Yes, England have won the Ashes. And the race of all time, what a scene here.
His life in those early days was very different to what it is now, because we were all amateurs at the time. I mean, they'd done television cricket in 1938 here at Lord's and also in 1939, but no one remembered that. And so the commentators very much left themselves to find out how to do it. And there was myself, and we had 1 or 2 experts like P.G.H. Fender, who's still alive, God bless him, and Crusoe, R.C. Robertson Glasgow, and Aidan Crawley, and they were the experts, and we just had to go along. They were really concentrating on the 1 or the 2 cameras. They probably had 2 then in those days, and left us to ourselves. And we tried to develop some sort of commentary. And the one thing we were always told is, only talk when you can add to the picture, and we were left to, work it out from there.
But in 1954, Le Binier issued a masterly document laying down the ground rules for all television sports commentaries. One instruction was build suspense.
Well, the direct thing of suspense interest was to persuade the viewer, if you like at cricket, that in the next over, if both of them scored 5 runs, he'd be the first person to have scored 100 centuries in Test cricket before he was 42 on a Wednesday, or whatever the thing would be. And all through sport, in particular, you can build this suspense interest and make the viewer at home, who can't calculate these things for himself or know them for himself, make him sit in near the edge of his chair.
Labinier's ground rules were so comprehensive that they remain just as relevant today.
Well, I used to try to analyse these things and put them down, and I think people were quite kind about looking at the paper occasionally. They could still disagree with it.
Some sporting events, by their very nature, were difficult to cover. Until 1949, the boat race could only be partially followed from cameras along the bank. But then, engineers managed to mount a camera on a launch to follow the entire race. One of the first cameramen to be waterborne was Duncan Anderson.
Well, the camera was obviously at the front of the boat, or the sharp end as it were, so that it could have an uninterrupted view of the boat race. And again, I remember on that memorable occasion when the Oxford boat sank, I was there right at the very start. It was obvious something was going to happen because the water was so rough. And incidentally, there was no photographic record of that sinking. The only pictures taken were from the television camera. And the following day, the pictures in the papers were taken off the tube. Nobody had any record of it.
And here you can see the Oxford crew sitting very low in the water. There's only 2.5 inches of freeboard on the side there, and with the waves they've been going through, I think they've taken a terrific lot of water in. Cambridge now running into rougher water as they come up to the end of the wall, and the water is breaking right over Cambridge as well, but they are a good, I should think, 4 or 5 lengths ahead. What do you think, Clayford?
Cambridge are having a much easier passage than Oxford, having shipped much less water at the start.
And Oxford are definitely sinking, I think. We come over onto the Oxford crew. Oxford are getting lower and lower in the water, and they definitely are sinking. Oxford has sunk. And there you have a very unusual view indeed of a crew in the boat race sinking. It hasn't happened since 1925.
Go ahead, Peter O'Sullivan.
And good afternoon to you, and welcome to the very windswept car home.
Finish with one in a bit. Let's have a bit tighter at the start. Stand by to move. The flag's up. The flag's up. Move to your roving position now. Hold it steady as you can. You can pull it wider now.
Pull down slightly, George.
A bit wider. Steady. Steady.
The dam must have fairly charged there.
Stand by to row.
He was pulled back and they're coming into the tapes and they're off. And they're off, and I should say...
On dry land, the moving camera was known as the roving eye. It could keep pace with the horses. This was the Lincolnshire handicap, and brought new excitement to the coverage of racing. People at home often got a better view than racegoers in the stands.
And here is Chief Barker leading up a tremendous dance with Chalk Stream and Offspring.
And keeping pace with the roving eye was another BBC van, the mobile commentary box of radio's Raymond Glendenning.
Now they're coming up 3 furlongs to go, and it is still Chief Barker.
Whirly
2 lengths
Burn
clear of
in the centre.
The demands of racing coverage were not just technical, as Dennis Munger remembers.
Well, Royal Ascot was the holy of holies and the racing scene. And there was this morning when one of the cameramen was making his way toward his camera position to check out his camera, and in the opposite direction came the Duke of Norfolk, who of course was the Queen's representative at Royal Ascot. And he stopped this individual and said, "Where are you going?" And the man said, "I'm going to my camera position." And His Grace the Duke of Norfolk said, "Have you a pass?" The man produced the pass and said, "Yes, I have this pass signed by the Duke of Norfolk." The Duke took the pass, glanced at it, tore it up, and said, "You no longer have a pass. I am the Duke of Norfolk, and until such time as you come back with a collar and tie and suitably dressed, you cannot go to your camera position." And even to this day, it is laid down that all BBC personnel at Ascot, particularly the Royal Meeting, must have lounge suits, collars and tie.
And at the post, easing him up, a very easy winner, looking over his left shoulder, Charlie Smirk and Lord Fox with Seaplane second, then comes Napoleon Bonaparte third.
So, we came to the end of our television outside broadcasts for this coronation year from Royal Ascot. We shan't be televising the racing tomorrow afternoon because some of the equipment has to be rushed up to Scotland in time for the Queen's entry into Edinburgh next week.
As early as 1950, television began to bring together lots of sports, some of them rather obscure, in a magazine programme. And it was the task of producer Barclay Smith to develop the right mix.
But I had already decided that if it was going to get a good viewing audience, which it did, I would play it rather for light entertainment than totally for serious sport. So it had an awful lot of inbuilt competitions, cars rushing around, and within this, and it worked well and it sounded rather nice. But one day, a young man up at Alexandra Palace called Paul Fox, who was then, I think, writing for the newsreel then, said, could I have a moment, could I talk to you about a programme idea? And so I said, yeah, sure, let's go and have a drink. And as he developed this idea, a cold hand clutched my heart because I could see this was the end of my TV sports magazine. But I said in my usual rather brutal way, yeah, I suppose it's got a future, doesn't sound too good to me, but you can take it to Dimmock if you want to, who was the total boss, and which of course he properly did. And that was, in fact, the start of the whole of that era of great sports journalism. And I recognised instinctively the moment he said it, that he was on the more modern tack than the thing that I was doing.
Good evening, welcome to Sportsview. Tonight's programme ranges from racing to boxing, from football to skating.
And that's really how it all began. We started it fortnightly. Some trepidation. Things, of course, went wrong. A lot of things, fortunately, went right. Roger Bannister very conveniently did the 4-minute mile, I think, on our second or third edition, and we rushed him into the studio. And that helped to bring attention to the programme. It was innovative, and I think the public went with us and enjoyed it. And again, we treated sport very seriously. We tried not... I mustn't mention newspaper names. We didn't try to treat it cheaply, as some newspapers would for sensation. Though, of course, we weren't averse to the good scoop or the good sensational story, provided we believed it to be true and accurate.
A year later, in September 1955, came commercial television. An outside broadcast, like every other department at the BBC, had to learn to compete.
Well, I think once we realised that independent television was a fact, it had a tremendous impact on us, and particularly on OBs, because, of course, the first thing that happened was a raid, an attempted raid on our producers. But George Barnes was director of television then, and Ian Jacob was director general. And they agreed that we really must resist this at all costs. So they put a lot of our producers onto contract. And the next thing, of course, was sports contracts themselves. We had quite a few long-term ones, but it had been very difficult to wheedle money out of Broadcasting House of Television, let alone for outside broadcast contracts and major sports contracts. But I said that we simply had to try and get the contracts, and was fully supported by Barnes and Ian Jacob. And this made a great deal of difference.
Peter Dimmock, anyhow, had a tremendous lot to do with our sport. And I remember our Director General, Ian Jacob, saying to him, now look, if you're really going to pay these competitive fees, what more is it going to cost? And Peter Dimmock said $250,000. And when it worked out, he was just about right. But we got our $250,000 and did the broadcasting.
It was reported at the time that I had an open checkbook. That was very far from the truth. You know, working in the BBC, that money is always very tight, and so are budgets. But it did mean that I could go out and talk to promoters in terms of extended term contracts. And we were able to hang on to all our major contracts.
When ITV started, they found that Dimmock had signed up almost every imaginable sport of any mass appeal except all-in wrestling. And the ITV, I think, turned to ITV wrestling rather in despair and were a bit mortified to find that their audience lapped it up.
There's a marvellous story about the final fee, which I don't know if it's true, but it's lovely, and Peter Dimmock won't mind me telling it. He went to Lord's one day to negotiate this fee, and all the old gentlemen were sitting around the table there in their cravats and things, looking very pucker, and Peter went in and said, look, gentlemen, you're all very busy, I'm busy, I'm not going to waste your time, the BBC even though is going through a hard time, all I can offer you is £100,000, there's no good be bartering with you, that's all I can offer, can I put that on the table? And they said, Mr. Dimmock, we do appreciate your kindness in doing this, would you mind going into the long room while we discuss it, because obviously we can't make an immediate decision. So about 10 minutes later they called him back. They said, Mr. Dimmock, we do appreciate how courteous you were. It was very, very kind, but cricket too is going through a hard time, and we simply couldn't take less than 120,000. He said, done, like that, and of course their faces dropped.
In the decade between the start of commercial television and the coming of colour, outside broadcasts of sport of all kinds increased in quantity, variety and quality. Some minority sports, like show jumping, became vastly more popular simply because they'd been on television. As the techniques of outside broadcasts developed and as more equipment became available, producers found they could go into greater detail. From pictures of just the last few holes of a golf tournament, cameras could cover play on every green. The television network had expanded to serve the whole of the United Kingdom, and with it went the technical ability to relay important events live from any part of the country. Wimbledon, a regular television event since before the war, later became the first sports outside broadcast in colour, a technical advance that gave a tremendous boost to televised sport. And rugby league, for years popular only in the north of England, steadily gained a national following.
Boston must score to begin it to Sullivan, and he does!
Television became important to many promoters, and in increasing numbers, the sporting venues made permanent arrangements to cater for the outside broadcast cameras. Sporting bodies which had been reluctant in the past, like the professional boxing authorities, eventually reached agreements that permitted a certain amount of broadcasting. Colour and the instant replay were shortly to revolutionise the coverage of sport. But no event could have better celebrated the achievements of the first 30 years of sports outside broadcasts than the final of the World Cup in 1966. England's win at Wembley was watched live by 30 million people in Britain and an estimated 400 million throughout the world.
We've had 2 goals each. Just 20 minutes of the game left. So that. He has done, yes! Yes! No! No, the linesman says no. The linesman says no. It's a goal! It's a goal! Oh, and the Germans go mad at the referee. This line, at the linesman who can only speak Russian and Turkish. Now then, Petke is the referee, looks at his watch. Any second now, it will all be over. 30 seconds by Watson. The Germans are going down and they can hardly get up. It's all over, I think. No, it's... And here comes Hurst. He's got... Some people are on the pitch. They think it's all over. It is now. It's 4. And Charlton. And the players bring themselves down. 10 seconds to go. Hurst has got a hat-trick. Hurst has got 3. It's all over.